Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll just get started. We're expecting a few more numbers, so they might drop in once we're underway. Just a couple of housekeeping things to tick off to begin with. Can I ask you all to just keep your cameras off and mute your mics during the presentations? If you've got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll see what we can do to answer them towards the end. And finally, just to let you know that the session will be recorded and posted for consumption over the next couple of days. Just to do a quick couple of introductions before we get started. I'm Michael Moynihan. I look after Information Security Education Scotland. I cover their corporate side and the GLOW environment. It should be a 50-50 split, but I would say that in reality, the majority of my time is spent looking after the GLOW environment. I'll pass you over to my colleague, Ger.
Who's just unmuted himself. Good morning. My name's Ger Grouse. I'm a secondee to the Information Commissioner's Office. In my other life, I'm the Global Education Director for Kidzania, and I have a research professorship at the University of Moscow. But I'm fascinated by what's going on here and what we've been doing, raising awareness of this children's code. I'll hand over to Jacob at this point.
Okay.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us. So yeah, my name's Jacob Orvik-Stott. I've got a slightly silly job title of Acting Head of Regulatory Futures here at the ICO, and in practice that means that I've been leading a lot of our work to do with the Children's Code, which I'll talk you through shortly.
Thanks very much, guys. So just to give you an overview of what we covered today, Jacob's going to spend maybe 15-20 minutes talking about the Children's Code, talking about why is there a specific code for children, what it is, who it's aimed at, children's, families, schools, and hopefully cover what local authorities need to do to be compliant. And then we'll move on to Ger, who will talk a bit more in detail about the code in schools and perhaps the roles of schools, teachers, and what resources are available for you. So at this point, I'll pass over to you, Jacob, if you want to present.
Brilliant, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just have the obligatory awkward silence while I get the slides up.
Looks good, thanks.
Thanks very much. So as I mentioned a second ago, my name is Jacob Orvik-Stott and I work for the ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office. So we are, if you haven't heard of us, the body that's responsible for upholding the UK public's information and data rights. So we're responsible for a range of things, including freedom of information and ensuring that government and other public sector bodies provide information to the public and journalists and others that are interested in the spirit of sort of transparency and accountability. And we're also responsible for the UK's data protection laws as well. And you may well have heard of the UK GDPR, for example. So in practice, we do lots of things. We produce guidance for organisations to help them conform with these laws. We deal with public complaints. We investigate where we have concerns. And in the worst case scenarios as well, we can do things like issue fines to organisations that have been particularly naughty. And as part of all of this work, we are responsible for writing codes of practice. And I'm here today to talk to you about the Children's Code, which is a new code of practice. And this is a code of practice for online services that are likely to be accessed by children in the UK. It covers quite a wide range of services, things like apps, social media platforms, digital games, connected devices, and also pertinently for today, things like EdTech as well. As I sort of touched upon earlier, it's not necessarily a new law, but it does articulate how we expect the UK's data protection laws to be followed in this context. It came into force formally a couple of weeks ago on the 2nd of September. Prior to that, we had a one-year transition period for the code. So this was a period of time, essentially an amnesty period, where we gave these online services time to prepare to make the changes that they needed to in how they use children's data. And we went for a 1 year because that was the longest possible we were allowed to actually give by Parliament. And we went for the longest possible period in recognition of the fact that we really hope that the code will have a transformative impact for children and parents, and we hope as well that online services will put in a lot of effort in implementing the code. And so we're now in a phase where we are enforcing the code and doing supervision activities and making sure that those online services have taken the steps that they needed to. In terms of what the code is, in very general terms, it's 15 interlinked standards that cover a wide range of things, covering things like core principles that online services should follow when they're designing their services. Relatedly as well, there's some standards that touch upon specific aspects of service design, like the design of privacy information and choices. And then other standards as well focus on sort of high risk data processing activities and how online services can build in safeguards there. So things like what to do when they're sharing children's data, what to do when they're using that data to sort of profile children and things like that. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what the code is. I'd like to talk about upfront why it's important for children, and children in this context is anyone under the age of 18 in the UK. We've written the codes and we'll be enforcing the code with the interests and needs of children at the front of our minds. This is partly because the government and us, by extension as a public body, have a duty to ensure that we respect the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in our work. And so that duty gave us the idea to use the UNCRC, as it's also known, as the framework for the code in general. And so one of the code's first standards is around the best interest of the child. And in short, that says that following the spirit of the UNCRC, online services must always consider the best interest of the child whenever they're using their data, and they must respect the rights that children hold under the UNCRC. So in practice, that means things like supporting children's rights to well-being and development, not showing them, for example, targeted content that might be harmful for them, or profiling them to deliver them adverts for alcohol and things like that. It means that children have rights to guardianship as well that must be supported. So they need to acknowledge the role of parents in helping children to navigate their digital lives and how their data is used. It also has a sort of more positive spin in it as well, and thinks about things like children's rights to be able to play, to learn online, and to generally develop their capacities and become a sort of autonomous person as their capacities develop and things like that. So it's not all about sort of negative things and protecting children from harm. The UNCRC as a framework also acknowledges that the significant positive benefits of technology and data in that as well. And as I sort of touched upon as well in my opening remarks, it's important for children because it does add protections from some more sort of egregious and potentially high risk forms of data use. So things like intrusive profiling, data sharing, tracking of their location and things like that. And lastly, it's important for children because it ensures that services are high privacy by default. So I think you may well be thinking that this all sounds quite good, but what does this actually look like in practice? And so I thought I'd actually give you a tangible example of one of the code standards, which is the transparency standard. So this gives practical advice to online services and says things like privacy information should be tailored to the age of the child. So 100-page legalese that's written in sort of highly complex language as a privacy policy is no longer really acceptable for children. I'm sure we've all experienced that in our own sort of personal use of technology and some softwares and websites and things like that. Related to this as well, the code says that where you are giving children information about privacy and how their data is used, it must be sort of prominent. You can't, hide it away behind hundreds of pages, or you can't sort of tuck it away in an obscure place at the bottom of a web page, for example. Thirdly, as well, the standard talks about the fact that services should provide children with bite-sized information at the point that it's actually needed. So, for example, you might have a pop-up where a child is about to share data with other social media users, explaining to them what the implications of this are and the fact that once the data has been shared, the other users may be able to do stuff with it and things like that. And that's all about making sure that children can sort of manage and understand the online world. And then lastly as well, the transparency standard also talks about ensuring that for younger children in particular, they can get the support of parents. So it talks about helping children and parents to kind of navigate privacy choices together, rather than parents being shut out of those decisions, or conversely sort of parents having total control over children's online lives. So that's just to give you a flavour of the kind of recommendations and areas of good practice that the code looks to encourage online services to adopt. So moving on to how it's relevant to you and the schools and sort of education sector, I think it's relevant for a number of reasons, really. I think the first thing to say is that schools can support children and their parents to build data literacy and to understand the rights that they hold under the Children's Code. This can be interpreted quite literally. So, for example, schools can help children and parents understand that they can now complain to platforms if they have an issue with how their data is used. And similarly, they can complain to us as an office if the platforms don't listen to those complaints. But you can also take this more broadly. And I think it's important to think about the fact that data and online services are such a ubiquitous part now of children's everyday lives. You know, particularly from the pandemic, they're now sort of increasingly learning online. They engage with their peers online, as we all know. They use online world to navigate news and media and understand the world and things like that. So it's now really, really important, I think, to build understanding of data literacy, you know, understanding what data is, who uses it, where the risks lie, and also how it can empower people. And I think that's so important, and schools can play a big part in kind of building that up. The second area of relevance, I think, is the fact that a lot of educational technologies, or edtech, will be covered by the code. And so both sort of schools and local authorities should do due diligence here. This might look like sort of asking providers whether they're aware of the code, asking them to show you the steps that these edtech providers have taken to conform with it, and then just generally making sure that when you're sort of procuring or buying an edtech service, they have protections that are offered to their child users, and they're just generally conforming with the UK's data protection laws as well. And then lastly as well, I think it's important to note that whilst the code doesn't apply to schools, schools don't have to conform with it. It doesn't mean that they can't learn from it or use it as a sort of source of reflection for what they're doing with their own use of pupils' data and things like that. So if we take the example of the transparency standard I just mentioned, that gives some really general good practice ideas for ways to help children understand how their data is used by schools and by local authorities as well. So that's why it's relevant. Moving on to sort of what you can do and what we can offer you as well. We have guidance on general data protection law called Your Data Matters. That screenshot you can see on the right with the fingerprint man is from that Your Data Matters stuff. So that guidance includes sort of lesson plans and workshops. It talks through children and pupils how data is used in everyday life, what data is, what the ICO does and things like that. And those resources are targeted at both sort of primary and secondary schools, depending on what your needs are. Relatedly as well, we've also got some code-specific resources of a similar nature that we'll be developing, and they'll be sort of published in the coming months. And then, as I touched upon in the previous slide, in addition to sort of building that data literacy and delivering sort of education on the code and data, you can also consider your relationship with edtech providers now and have a look at what your school or what your local authority might be doing with these edtech providers, with a view to having that conversation with them about the protections that they're offering their child users, and their code conformance. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the Children's Code and the ICO and data protection. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, look forward to having a sort of open discussion about that now.
Thanks very much, Jacob. Does anyone have any questions at the moment that would like to ask Jacob just before we move on to Ger? I'm not seeing any movement in the chat. Thanks very much for that, Jacob. I suppose one point I'd just like to draw on that you touched on within your presentation there was about the increased use of digital technology from children, and I suppose it's increased again further during the pandemic period. And I obviously really welcome the Children's Code's existence. I think it's fantastic that the ICO have actually taken this stance, and they're putting the onus onto the suppliers of the services to make sure they're compliant in relation to this. In relation to education, I think it's great that, you know, everyone has to consider this when buying ed tech, but I think it's important also to recognise from an education perspective that for children, the digital and personal persona, as far as I'm concerned, isn't split anymore like it was 4 or 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, you could clearly identify that the physical outplaying, doing this, that, and the next thing, it didn't involve technology, and now we have technology. I'd go as far as to say that the digital element has eclipsed the physical. And for us in education and working with children, it's been rapid. The speed of change of technology has been quicker than we can keep up with, than we have can adjust to. So it's really great that this coming into play, because for children, I think they don't recognise a life out with the digital. They don't see the difference there. So this is really, really good. But also that gives us a problem as well with children, because they don't value data. So again, it's great that we're having these resources here, and I would urge those that work in the education community to try and get the or try to let children understand the value of data. All they want to do is consume at the moment. They want to consume. So I think it's great work, and again, I think that this plays a big part in it, but I think within education, we all need to recognise that we've got a bigger part about educating children about the value of data and what they can do. I can see a question's just come in there. Ask a question from parents' perspective. Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, does this apply to them not targeting children? Jacob?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I have to say, actually, we've already started to see the fruits really of the code. So in July and August this year, you may well have seen that Facebook and Instagram, for example, announced they were stopping the targeting of advertising to under 16s beyond their age and location, which they obviously need to make sure that they're not sort of bombarding them with age inappropriate stuff. So that was really good. We also saw some changes announced as well around a similar time from TikTok and Google and things like that. So yeah, social media and all of the major platforms that are, as I said earlier, such a ubiquitous part of children's lives were one of our sort of main areas of focus, and we're really sort of happy about some of the early changes that we're seeing.
And Joanne's just also asked, is this just in Scotland? No, it's UK wide. Joanne? You're welcome. Any other questions? If not, then I would pass presenting rights, as I would say, over to Ger, if that's okay.
Thanks, Michael. Let me just get organised at this front.
Problem at all.
There we are.
Let's go
from there. Thanks, Michael. I wanted to focus in the first instance on the concept that Jacob talked about. It's about children's rights. So these changes have come about, and I think by and large, who would not welcome them? The internet, I think, Michael, was one of the phrases that was thrown around in our meetings. The internet wasn't designed with children in mind, and you mentioned it, we're playing catch up. But now talking about children's rights, clearly the industry-facing side of things has been addressed, but you need to know that your rights exist, and you need to know what they are before you can become part of them. And in a sense, that's where I look at schools, and I look at more than a school. We've experienced in the last 2 years examples of where schools have gone unbelievable beyond their original definition. The one that you see in front of you is one of my favorite schools, and what you see there is food for the families to take home. We in good schools, we look after our children and after our families, and we look after their rights, and we make sure that they know. And that's why I was very happy to work with the ICO on this awareness piece. Good schools are places that care for the well-being of their children, families, and communities, and it will always go the extra mile. This in loco parentis bit, and we can't do it. It's not even a matter of we can't do it as well. We can't do it without the support of schools in this, because I'm also a parent, and I would not have known anything about this up to this moment in time had I not been involved with the ICO. I would look as a parent to be guided by the school, to be notified, if you wish, by the school, and made aware what it all means. And schools are already doing that, and they are, of course, already involved in many of these issues. So the Children's Code is an extension of how schools function. They are at the heart of their communities, because the other thing that we need to think about is sometimes this may affect clubs and out-of-school activities that children are involved in as well. And the awareness piece becomes like a pebble in a pond. We need to think of those rings. And then finally, parents, of course, have an enormous responsibility and an important role in this, because in the end, if we look at a 24-hour day across 365 days, children are much more likely to be engaged in online activities unsupervised, undirected, much more at home than they are at school. Yet the school has that incredibly important role to educate the community about the rights of the child. And I think, certainly from my experience, that in certain parts of the country that have greater levels of disadvantage in all sorts of ways, this is sometimes harder to do than in other parts. So the role of the school there is even more important. And we took the kind of line at ICO, as I think is a wise thing to do, that you can't do these things on your own, because one, you haven't got the expertise on your own, and also you haven't got the reach. So we established an advisory panel, and Michael Moynihan has been on that on behalf of Education Scotland, and we put together a group of people who could help us in all sorts of ways with their wisdom and their guidance, and also who could help us test certain things out, who could advise us on parental issues, on PSHE, on all sorts of other things, including research and evaluation. A little bit about that later on. And we work with other partners as they come along, clearly with the regional offices, the ICO's regional offices across the country, but also already with the Week Junior, BBC Own It, Five Rivers, and there will be much more of this. All these people who are interested in these children, their rights and their well-being. And then kind of comes the question, well, how do we get from A to B with little children and with slightly older young people? And bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that much of this is done at home, away from the school. Yet we need to jointly with the parents make sure that these things happen. So last July, there was the first publication, which was a kind of primary and secondary publication around personal data and data protection. And those resources are already available on the ICO website, and perhaps with the help of Education Scotland, we can get the reminder of that out to schools and teaching colleagues again. What we're seeing next is the publication of the specific children's code resources. We expect them to be published across the UK in October 2021. They are at the moment in near final draft stage, at which point they will go to Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and English authorities and schools to look at, to give us more feedback, and then they will be produced and published. And again, we will get them through networks with support of Education Scotland. In your case, we will get them out to everybody. They will be accompanied by an infographic, of which you will see in front of you the second draft. The infographic, I think, will become a very important piece, because I see that as almost the bridge between the school and the home in terms of that information and awareness process. It becomes the talking point, and it will have all sorts of other uses as well, of course. The resources are at primary and secondary activity, and we really want them to be the resources that children learn and become aware rather than are taught. So as I said earlier, we're in near final draft stage. They will be full of activities, and they will lead to an understanding of how it all works. I mean, my daughter, who's 15 and who should have been on that list of others consulted regularly, my daughter compared it at some point to a pedestrian crossing. You know, everybody knows what it's for. Sometimes it's a nuisance to have to walk up the road and cross the road and wait for the green man, but everybody understands that it's the right thing to do for safety reasons and to look after our young people. We need to take the children's code to that same place in the consciousness, and I think we can, certainly with the support of schools, we can. And that is kind of the bit that I think educationally where we need to be. I would like my 15-year-old to be ready for unexpected items in the bagging area of her life. And I think that the awareness around the children's code, the knowing what my rights are in relation to the children's code, and the knowing which actions I can take and how I can complain are key. And when we have those embedded, then our children will be able to cope slightly better with the unexpected items in the bagging area. And of course, they will pass that on. And we know my favorite quote. We know that the mind once enlightened cannot again become dark, and it becomes meaningful and part of their life. So I'd like to thank everybody in Education Scotland and all the people who work in schools, teachers and other teaching professions in advance for helping us make this happen. And any feedback will always be greatly received. So thanks very much for supporting us in this.
Thanks very much, Ger, for that. Does anyone have any specific questions they'd like to ask Ger or either of the three of us at this point? Joanne Thompson, feel free to speak.
Hi there, hello. That was a very enjoyable presentation. I'm wondering, what are you looking for at the ICO? Are you looking for parents to complain that their child is being targeted, you know, with particular adverts? Is that the sort of, I don't know, the official line that you're going to be addressing and picking up with people? Are they, and is it an offence for them? Is it a fine? What happens?
Sure, so I can take that one again, and then feel free to chip in with anything I've missed. So I think in a very general sense, our first port of call is to try and encourage the platforms themselves to sort of proactively make changes, and the code is sort of written as such to try and make them design their services with privacy in mind. However, we're aware that that's not going to land in all cases, and we wanted to have a sort of backstop where children and parents can make complaints to us should they encounter undesirable experiences that go against the spirit of the code and the standards of the code. And if their data is being used to target them with sort of problematic content, then that would potentially be an infringement of the code. So they can make complaints to us. Once they have made a complaint, it sort of goes into our general systems, and that's where we may decide to get in touch with the organisation, ask them what's going on, ask them if it's true and why the child has seen the content. And depending on what the organisation says, it might then escalate into a sort of wider investigation. And in the very worst case scenarios, if we're seeing that the organisation just isn't taking the steps to conform with the code that we'd expect, and it's a particularly egregious offence, we can do things like fine them. And the scariest end of the fining scale is 4% of their global turnover, I think, which is a fairly sort of substantial fining power and stuff. But in practice, we would hope that the online service would address the concerns that we have well in advance of us having to go down that route. I think you're on mute, Michael.
It was always going to happen. I was just simply saying thanks, Jacob. Any other questions just now? You don't? Okay, so just one thing I wanted to pick up on myself. You know, we kind of talked a wee bit about EdTech and responsibilities in EdTech and responsibilities for the local authorities of the schools to be assessing as such in line with the children's code. So normally I can say with confidence that they'd be checking that they comply with the GDPR. Would you be expecting the local authorities and schools to be referencing the children's code when they're looking at products, or would it be sufficient to just say, are you GDPR compliant, which is the standard text that I tend to see in procurement exercises?
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful to add the children's code to that. The extent to which the code applies to EdTech providers is a little bit complicated by the nature of what the EdTech service is. So in very general terms, basically, if the EdTech provider is sort of offering like an off-the-shelf service, or the EdTech provider has a fair degree of influence over sort of what the service looks like, then it's likely that the code does apply. the code only won't apply to edtech providers where the school has given them very sort of specific instructions on exactly how the data will be used and how the service is structured, so that in effect it's the school conceptualizing and implementing the service and the edtech providers just helping them to do that. So in a lot of scenarios, it would be very helpful just to ask them about code conformance in addition to the sort of standard UK GDPR stuff.
So I suppose to summarise that there, just for my understanding, it's more likely to apply if you are literally consuming an app like Show My Homework or something like that, whereas if you are, I'm going to use the term commissioning, which isn't right, but if you are commissioning an app to provide specific services for you using specific data sets, then it wouldn't apply, because ultimately the school, I suppose for want of a better word, is managing how the app uses the information rather than the app determining how it would manage information. That's
exactly it. So if you're sort of commissioning a bespoke service, then without going into the legal reads of it, essentially what you're doing is the app just becomes an extension of the school's offline activities and the educational public tasks. Whereas if you're buying a sort of off-the-shelf thing, it's quite likely that the off-the-shelf thing might have other sort of general revenue generation features that aren't strictly necessary for the core of the sort of educational task and stuff. So yeah, that framing is correct, I'd say, Michael.
So just by extension of that then, for clarity for myself and everyone else on the call, would I be right to say then that, not right to say, but whilst the code wouldn't apply in that respect, there would be a natural expectation that we would naturally be conforming anyway with the code. It wouldn't be, when I say it would apply, it's not regulated in the same way, but there would be an expectation through the role that you're providing that you would conform with the code naturally anyway.
I would say so, for sure. I mean, all schools and local authorities obviously share the vision of the code to champion the best interests of children and respect their rights and things like that. So if you even generally ask edtech providers, what do you do to keep children safe, and have you definitely considered children's rights and whether they respect them, that would be a perfectly sensible question to ask regardless of the code, in my view. So yeah, I think for several reasons it definitely can't hurt to ask them about the general safeguards and also ask them about whether they're aware of the code and whether they're conforming with it.
Excellent, thanks. That's quite clear to me. One other thing, I suppose, moving away from EdTech, and I suppose this is more for the educationalists on the call for any thoughts that they have on it or not. But, you know, we cover EdTech because we use it in education in the delivery of education, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. But we touched earlier on in things. I think somebody had mentioned TikTok, Facebook. It was Joanne actually mentioned TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And in my mind, it's very important to recognise, whilst we don't necessarily have control over Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, these types of things, and we don't generally utilise them in the delivery of education, they can significantly impact the children whilst they're within the school environment. So by extension, we need to be mindful of that, because, you know, if someone was getting physically bullied in the playground at lunchtime or in the classroom or whatever, a school would take action on that. If they're getting bullied via Snapchat in the playground or in the classroom during school time, then the school has to take similar action on that. And I think there's still a bit of a gap there in how we are dealing with these things in education, and it points back to my previous point about technology is moving so fast. I look at 1 year in technology, I equate it to dog years. You know, 1 calendar year would equate to about 7 years. iPads never existed 11 years ago. They're now an everyday item. Everybody's using them. The physical and digital divide, I don't believe exists anymore. And we aren't keeping up. We're trying to keep up. We're not, but we need to recognise that, you know, the medium in which it happened doesn't matter to us. It's the impact on the children. So I think it's important for the guys on the call and ourselves to recognise that, yeah, EdTech we can control and we can have a handle in, but we still need to be mindful that your TikToks and your Snapchats and all these things can all impact the children, and that the code applies to them, and we can complain and do all these things. I don't know if there's any thoughts or any other questions for anyone else in the audience today.
I'd just like to endorse what you've just said, Michael. I think that is very true, and I can also see as a former languages teacher, I can see the use of technology, including the social media, to become part of in-school and out-of-school language learning, for example. Why would I not want my GCSE students in England, for example, be in direct contact with their counterparts in Madrid and communicate in a way that is 21st century communication, so that we do away with the word pen pal. Yeah. Now there are consequences then when that happens that we will need to be mindful of as schools, as educators and carers of the children.
Yep, 100%. I can't agree anymore. Joanne, another question from you. Joanne's asking, would the data gathering, if we are gathering info by Microsoft's Teams and Google when we share documents to pupils, would they need to share with children what info they are gathering if they are?
And I think broadly speaking, we would expect those services to have at least communicated to the schools very clearly what they're doing with children's data, and there might therefore be a subsequent role for the school to share that. But I think it would also be in the schools and local authorities' rights to come back to the platform themselves, given the code will apply to a lot of their services, and ask them to produce the information about how to clearly communicate to children how their data is used and things like that. And I think we've done sort of general engagements with the larger platforms like Microsoft and Google, and they're very aware of the code. We have a digital economy team here at the ICO whose sole role it is to speak to the larger systemic players, like the kind that I just sort of mentioned and stuff. So mentioning the code to those big platforms shouldn't be a surprise to them, and it may well be that they've already got, as I touched upon earlier, resources that do that communication piece.
And I suppose just to add to that, thanks Jacob, just to add to that, I suppose Joanne, in relation to the answer there, if you're talking about kids using their own version of Microsoft Teams and sharing things in their own personal life out with school, then yes, I would agree. If you're looking at it from, let's say, a GLOW perspective, then the responsibility to advise the learners, if you choose to advise them, would reside with your local authority. So as things stand just now, Education Scotland have a contract with Microsoft. So when we talked about the EdTech, we have the contract. This is the information you're going to get. This is what you can do with it, etc., etc. And each local authority within Scotland are data controllers, and Education Scotland sit at the centre, ultimately processors. We provide a service, and local authority chooses to consume the service. So, Joanne, I suppose the legitimate purpose for processing that data, the children's data, resides with each local authority, and each local authority can choose the same or do it differently. A lot of them do it under public tasks. Some talk about legislative right to education, but there wouldn't, in the GLOW instance, be a direct responsibility for Microsoft to let them know. That should be very, very clear within the privacy policy that your local authority has, the same way we have one at Education Scotland that says we take this information, this is what we do with it, this is where we store it, this is why we do it. And that devolves down to yourselves, Joanne, as data controller to inform the students in that context.
If I may quickly add to that, Michael, I think there's the particular structure and context that you just mentioned in Scotland is actually probably an opportunity, because it means that relative to England, where the schools are the data controllers, not every single school has to, have that conversation with the providers, and it can be done centrally. And if the local authorities or yourselves as Education Scotland is kind of having that conversation, then they can ladder that down to all of the schools in their network and stuff. So there's a kind of opportunity to speak with a collective voice and for that information to be shared where those kind of conversations are happening.
Yep, excellent. Well, we've got a couple of minutes to spare, so we might get 4 minutes back here, guys. Are there any more questions? And if not, I think I'll wrap up. Can I thank Ger and Jacob again for taking the time out of their day to come and talk about the children's codes, and hopefully we'll get you back again. Are there any parting thoughts from you guys before we finish up?
Only thank you for having us, and thank you for hosting, Michael. And I think thanks to Education Scotland for helping us get everything out there when it arrives. It's brilliant.
Yeah, no, I would echo those thanks, and then probably just end on a plug to have a look at the Children's Code website, which I can put a link to in the chat channel in a sec if you're interested to know more.
Please do, thanks. And thanks everybody for attending. Okay.
Michael, just a wee comment from me, it's Kirsty, just to say
No.
we'll make sure this video goes up on our, no.
No,
just
don't want it.
just make sure this video will go up, or a link to this video will go up on digilearn.scot, so we'll make sure we share it via that way as well, because I think it'll be really useful to have that for people to look at afterwards as well. Great.
Much appreciated, Kirsty. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, guys. Cheers.